We're going to be continuing our study tonight in the book of Galatians. If you want to open up to chapter 6. One thing we do as Christians is talk about the necessity of love, but what does that love look like? In the last lesson or two in this study, we've read about the Apostle Paul directing Christians to walk by the Spirit, to not participate in the works of the flesh. And he's very specific about a number of things. Those who practice the works of the flesh will not inherit the kingdom of God. Those who walk by the Spirit are not going to gratify the desires of the flesh. The natural outcome of walking by the Spirit is the fruit of the Spirit. That's what's going to be borne out in the life of one who is walking that way. But this bearing of fruit, it's not a competition. It's something that we are striving to do, and it's not in comparison to anyone else. Rather than provoking one another and envying one another, we are to be helping one another to grow and to bear fruit. So as we get into chapter 6 tonight of Galatians, it's really this idea of helping one another that Paul expands upon and kind of showing us what does that look like. As he's gone through these works of the flesh, as he's gone through this fruit of the Spirit, as he ended chapter 5 by saying, let us not become boastful, challenging one another, envying one another, and he's been talking about how we are to live. Okay, well, what's that look like? That's going to be our lesson tonight, or at least the first part of this chapter, in thinking about bearing one another's burdens, what it looks like to love one another. The first thing that he mentions in verse 1 is basically that something needs to be done here then. Brethren, if any man, let me start again there. Brethren, even if a man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. So Paul begins with a situation where a person is caught in any trespass. Now, Paul's not saying you're going around trying to catch people in trespasses, in people's sins, but rather a person is caught. He's trapped in sin. He is entangled or ensnared by sin. The idea there is being taken by surprise, it being kind of unexpected. We are seeing a Christian that is being overtaken by sin. And so that's what Paul is giving instruction about here. Well, what does he say to do? He says, restore such a one. Paul says that we're not to stand by and do nothing. We're not to despise the person. We're not to condemn the person. We are not gossiping to people, but rather we are to restore the person. And the word that's used there for restore has the idea there of like setting a fractured bone. You're mending, you're knitting it together. And that's the concern, that person being restored. As Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. And so restoring such a one is, Paul says, that's the concern. Who is to do that? He says, you who are spiritual. So it's the spiritual that are to be involved in that. If we say, well, who is that? It would go back immediately then to the context of what we've been talking about. The one who's walking by the Spirit, the one who's observed as bearing this fruit of the Spirit based upon the lives that they are living. The spiritual minded one is the one who is walking in that direction. They see an opportunity, they take responsibility to do that, to help one who's been captured by this sin. How is that to be done? In a spirit of gentleness, he says. So you're to go to the one who is captured by this sin, and you're supposed to go to that one in a spirit of gentleness. A lot of wisdom there in just those few thoughts. I don't know if you've ever been approached by someone before, sometime in your life, and maybe it was anything but the spirit of gentleness. And that goes a long way when someone comes to you with a gentle spirit. It goes a long way the other way too, but usually not so well. There's a reason why we need to be gentle, and that's certainly a characteristic that is revealing itself in the fruit of the Spirit. That's one of those things that we see, and we're coming to someone with our emotions, with our words under control, all of those things in check, and that would certainly be a sign of maturity if that is the case. Certainly immaturity if someone comes to you yelling and screaming. A little bit different situation, but you're going to that person in that kind of a spirit because you're concerned about them and you want to restore them. There's also included into this a warning. Each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. The one who is spiritual, who's trying to do this good thing, trying to restore the brother or sister, must keep watch on himself or herself. There is a temptation to sin in the process. What could that be? It could be something, as he's going to go on to talk about, spiritual pride. It could be in taking that upon yourself and being too high-minded with that. We have to be mindful that anyone can fall into temptation and fall into sin. And even when one is trying to do the right thing, often one can become weak in the process of all of that and even sin in spite of the best intentions. So he's saying, be careful, be aware, don't take this lightly, and don't be unaware of the dangers of that. Secondly, he mentions bearing the burden. Verse 2, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. That's what bearing one another's burdens is described as, fulfilling the law of Christ. Christ, of course, the ultimate example of love and serving. It's Jesus who bore our sins on the cross. It's Jesus that makes it possible for us to be restored to him. And we are commanded to love others as Christ loved us. We are to forgive others as Christ has forgiven us. So bearing burdens is really following in the footsteps of Jesus, as that is often what he is seen to be doing. And that's what Paul has talked about even earlier in chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. Through love, serve one another, thus fulfilling the law, kind of the same principle there. But also included in this, when you think about bearing one another's burdens, how do you do that? How do you bear someone's burdens? Well, for sure, there has to be a relationship there. This command implies that there's a relationship with one another. How can you possibly help each other or bear something if there's not a relationship, if we don't have fellowship with that person? If you don't know somebody, how are you possibly going to help them bear a burden? It's just really not possible. But that kind of speaks to the relationship that we are to have, right? I mean, we're to have an open and close relationship that welcomes deeper conversation, that shows that we're more than just very casual friends at best, but that we have a closer relationship, that it's not just obligatory type conversations, but that rather we have a deep, genuine concern for one another. We want to spend time with one another. We want to talk to one another. We want to get to know each other, and are concerned about each other, not only spiritually, but also physically. And then, of course, we want to help each other grow, and we want to be there for one another if something happens and there's a case like it is here of needing to help restore someone. That relationship has to be there if we're really going to accomplish any good with that. But that really is a beautiful picture of what God has given us, though, is it not? We walk by the Spirit. We're going to love one another more in that process of loving one another more. We learn more about one another. We're bearing each other's burdens. We're there to help one another and to be there for each other. And if the case comes around, then we're also there to help restore anyone who's caught up by transgression. So it really is a beautiful thing to think about what is being talked about here. But of course, it doesn't end right there. Like anything, there's a proper way, and then there's a problem or the potential for problems. And that's what he's going to go on to talk about next in verse 3. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. And so there's a proper way to go about it, like we've just talked about, but there's also a great temptation there, and that temptation would be one of pride. It's important that we read these things carefully, because it will help us fight against pride. And, he's just talked about at the very end of chapter 5 of not being boastful and not challenging one another. And now we're supposed to have this relationship, this closeness to help one another and restore one another as the case may be. But then there's the possibility of someone thinking that he's more than what he really is. And, Paul's not saying here that if you really are important, then you can think yourself something, but if you're not, then you're nothing. No, the emphasis really is on that middle part about being nothing and seeing ourselves in the situation we really are. Before God, before his mercy and grace and all that, we really aren't a whole lot. We really are nothing. And if we think we're something, we are really deceiving ourselves. And so before we pat ourselves on the back or really think we're something, or more harmfully think we're better than somebody else, that can really be a problem and be a temptation and really cause some issues. Because the gospel, as we've been talking out through this whole series and thinking about that walk that we are on, the gospel is supposed to be creating a new image of who we are. It's not just me anymore. It's not my life and my desires and who I was. It's what I am in Jesus now. My sin and God's grace should humble me. And yet his grace should empower me because that should be where my value really comes from. The praise and honor that comes from God should make up who I am, not just, look at me, I'm so great, look what I'm doing. But it should be about who God is and what he's done. So my value really isn't in myself, but it really is in God, who loves me and values me and ultimately gave himself for me. That's the new image that we are to have, and that's what the gospel is supposed to do. But we do harm if we make it about ourselves. And Jesus' approval of me is what matters. If I think I'm something and I'm not, of course, I'm not without Jesus, then I'm gonna have problems because I don't see myself as I really should. We're really made valuable in Jesus, and that's where our focus needs to be. If anyone thinks he's something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work. And so the emphasis here then is on the fact that it's not a competition. It's not a comparison. We're not here so you can put one person against another. We're not here to put you up on one side of the screen and somebody else on the other side. That's not what this is about at all. We're talking about relationships. We're talking about restoring someone's spirituality, the closeness that we are to have. You can't make a contest out of that and think that that's going to bring everybody closer and more together and restore one who is caught up into sin. But rather, our eyes need to be kept focused on God, not looking at other people and what they're doing. Comparison kind of wrecks people in a couple different ways. On one end, comparison leads to pride. Well, we think we're doing better than someone else. And so we like those comparisons, right? Because I'm doing better than somebody else. That's not going to bring me closer to anybody, or it's not really going to help anything. And then the second comparison then is the other side of it. Well, I'm doing so much worse than somebody else. Somebody else is doing better than me. In fact, I might as well just give up. I can't really do anything because somebody else is better than I am. That's not a good situation to be in either, because now I'm viewing myself as nothing because I'm making a comparison with someone else in which I viewed myself as being lacking. And then in some ways, that's also a bit of pride as well, because now we really need somebody to compliment us and build us up and say, no, you're just as good as the other person, whenever that really shouldn't be a situation at all. We shouldn't be fishing for compliments for ourselves or telling somebody how lousy we are. That really shouldn't be what it's about. Both are sinful and both are damaging. And so this passage here, let each one examine his own work, it is important, because stop comparing yourself to one another. That's not what this is about. Look at your own work. Look at your own situation before God. Take joy in that, and not in comparing yourself one to another. I hope that sounds a little bit refreshing. It should be, to think about in those kinds of terms. Preachers don't need to compare themselves with other preachers. If that's where our worth comes, that's a bad thing. Elders don't need to compare themselves with one another or view themselves as greater or lesser than someone else. There's not supposed to be comparison and competition there, because it's about the fullness of what's going on. Churches aren't supposed to compare themselves with other churches. We are the church here. That's what's important, not what somebody else is doing or some other place is doing, or what they're involved with or not, either in condemning ourselves or making ourselves look better. That's not what we're supposed to be about. And the same thing, of course, is true with Christians. We're not to compare ourselves with other Christians. Let each one examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone and not in regard to another. It's just about yourself. Do the work you're given to do. Take joy in your work that you've been granted to by God. Don't make it a competition or a comparison. That's not what it's supposed to be, and that's a temptation for sin to come in. That's a temptation for there to be divisiveness and division and all those bad things, and that's why Paul has to warn about that, because that's the kind of thing that really happens. All right, then the last part here in verse 5, for each shall bear his own load. Now, if you just read that, you think, well, that's kind of the opposite of what he just says in verse 2 about bearing one another's load. But again, think of the context we're just talking about. It's not a contradiction from verse 2, but it is a point from the previous verse about carry your own load. Do what you're supposed to do. Don't compare your load to someone else's. Stop worrying about how you're doing in comparison to someone else. Just think about what God's word says and try to do that. Focus on those things. And in so many ways, this is really comparable to the parable of the talents. Not everybody has 5 talents. Not everybody has 2 talents. Maybe somebody only has 1 talent. But the purpose of the parable of the talents wasn't for the guy with 5 to say, "Woo, I've got 5, you only got 2," or something like that. That wasn't about that at all. It was about responsibility, doing things with what you have. The guy with 1, he could have had every bit as much of the glory in the end as the guy with 5, but he didn't do anything. And so that was really the point. It never was about comparing with one another. Oh, you've got 5, I've only got 2. It was about what they did with what they were given. The same thing is true here. Each one shall bear his own load. We've been granted different responsibilities, different loads. We have different opportunities. And you can't just make comparisons about that or slap a label as better or worse than something else. That's really not relevant. What matters is what you do with what's been granted to you. That's it. What do you do with what you have and the situation you are involved in? If we look at it that way, then there's no room for pride, because after all, before God, we're kind of all in the same boat, right? We're not really anything before God. But because of God and because of Jesus, We do have value, but you don't throw that in anybody's face. And you sure don't make a comparison about being greater when we've all sinned and we all desperately need Jesus anyway. So it's a point that's well made here in regards to how we should view one another, how we should view ourselves, so that we're not trying to make that comparison and that competition that so often can creep in if we aren't careful. Carry your own load. Help each other as you can. When somebody's caught in a trespass, help one another. Have that relationship to where you can help and be successful in restoring such a one. But not so you can throw it over their head, or not so you can tell somebody else, hey, look what I did. I bet you didn't do that. But because we're there for one another, because we love one another. We are living out what Christ has done for us in our relationships with each other. And that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. And so these verses have a lot of meaning and a lot of value. And we know the way that man often is. And there's a reason why there's so many warnings like this. We need to care for one another. And we need to care enough to act when someone is caught up in a trespass. But it also needs to be done with gentleness. We also have to watch ourselves so that we're not caught up into temptation and into sin. We don't want to be caught up into pride. We need to view ourselves as we actually are. We are God's own possession. We are treasured in his sight. But it's because of his grace and his love and his mercy, not because any of us are just so great. And so we need to see ourselves that way and look at your own work, look at your own responsibility, focus on that, and don't make it about anything else. And when we do that, great things will happen. And we can enjoy the work that God has given us. We can be there for one another, and it doesn't have to be ugly. I hope this evening, as we think about some of these things, it kind of hits home to our way of thinking about who we are and the glories that we have in Jesus Christ. You know, we're meant to have a close relationship with one another, but it's not to be for anything other than a good thing, and it's to be a helpful thing. But we've probably seen many times in maybe other places that it can get bad if that's not the case. But that's not God's intention. He wants us to be close, wants us to be there to help one another, and wants us to show that kind of love and appreciation for one another. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, I hope that you'll think about your life and your situation, understand the greatness of being in Christ, what it means for us, how bad we are and how worthless we are compared to what he has done. But he gives us value. He gives us worth. He makes life worth living and makes it possible for us to not just go through life and live, but to look forward to that home in heaven. Look forward to all the glories of that and to be there with one another and with the faithful of all ages and with him. And how tremendous that is to think about. Tonight, if we can help you tonight in any way, let it be known by coming forward so that we stand and sing.
Bring Christ your broken life.